I wanted to bring in Rob Mackey, who has just come from the Biden event. He is in Los Angeles, and Li Fang is in San Francisco. And I want to underscore something. We don't know the delegate count right now. We don't know who's winning that count. While Joe Biden seems to have won many more states at this point in this 14-state race, in addition, American Samoa. The actual numbers of delegates are massive in Texas and California, and Bernie Sanders is ahead in Texas, and AP has said that he has won California. So we don't know ultimately who's won the most delegates tonight. But Rob Mackey is with us in Los Angeles. You just came from the Biden election speech. Talk about what's happened there and what the reaction was in the room.
Yes, I did. It was outdoors. It was at a baseball field just off Obama Boulevard in the Baldwin Hills area of Los Angeles. It was a relatively small crowd, a few hundred people, and Joe Biden gave quite a short address. He was very revved up. He shouted a lot of his remarks. He took a couple of obvious swipes at Bernie Sanders. He said something about how the pundits had counted his own campaign out. They'd said his campaign was dead, but now it might be the other guy who is out of the race. He had a couple of characteristic stumbles when he was introducing himself at the beginning. He pointed to his wife and his sister who flanked him and got them confused, and then corrected himself to laughter. And he, at one stage when he tried to hit Bernie Sanders on gun control, he stumbled over his words and just sort of gave up, and the crowd sort of laughed along with him. It was a very mixed performance.
Rob, I also wanted to ask you, when you're at the Biden rally or the Biden speech, so you said there were a few hundred people. Did you get a sense that it was mostly campaign staff there, or is there like some indigenous crowd of people that are super psyched about Joe Biden as a candidate?
I mean, it was difficult to tell. It was definitely the people behind Biden seemed to have been bussed in. They were definitely campaign staffers. There were a lot of local politicians, and they brought their own people, I think, was part of the crowd. It didn't seem, people weren't massively enthusiastic. I was at the Warren event in East Los Angeles last night. It was far larger. There were several thousand people, and people were very revved up for that speech. This was more reminiscent for me of some of the rallies I attended that Hillary Clinton gave in 2015, 2016. A smaller crowd, an older crowd, and not hugely enthusiastic.
In Los Angeles, local news station Fox 11 is reporting an emergency motion was filed by the Bernie Sanders campaign asking for a Los Angeles County judge to keep polling centers open for an additional 2 hours due to long lines and reported problems with voting machines. The motion comes after countless residents complained of wait times of more than 2 hours, primarily in the Westwood, San Fernando Valley, Los Feliz, and North Hollywood areas. But I wanted to ask you about your reporting on allegations by Sanders supporters that Biden exaggerated about his record as a civil rights activist as a young man. What did you find when you looked into these claims, Rob?
Well, yes, I mean, it's quite fascinating that you have now, if you see a more narrowed race where it's essentially Biden against Bernie Sanders, one of the things that's clear about Bernie Sanders' record as a young man is that there is film footage of him being arrested, protesting. There's film footage and still photographs of him being a civil rights activist. He was a member of CORE. He was the kind of college student who took part in those social movements in the 60s. Joe Biden, on the other hand, for much of his career and his own biography, his own autobiography, made no mention of playing any role in those movements. But during his campaign for the presidency in 1987, as some prominent Sanders surrogates, including Sean King, have pointed out, Biden started to say that he had been one of those guys who marched and sat in and all that. And then towards the end of that campaign, in September of 1987, when the plagiarism scandal was raised, when Biden borrowed heavily from the life story of the labor leader Neil Kinnock, He admitted in a sort of offhand way that he didn't really play any part in those. He said he wasn't a joiner. He didn't take part in the social movements, in civil rights marches, or in the anti-war protests. And then, strangely, in recent years, Joe Biden has started to say again frequently that his political education came through the black church when he would attend he named specific civil rights pastors in Delaware, that he would go to their churches as a young man, as a 17-year-old, he said, to plan out with fellow activists where they were going to march, what desegregation protests they were going to take part in. And there's no real direct evidence of any of this. There's no objective, there's no photographs, there's no contemporary reports at the time. And what the campaign itself says is they offer a single individual who is a former president, a state president of the NAACP in Delaware, Richard Mouse Smith, who says that, yes, he took part in these things with Joe Biden. But in the telling of the stories, they've frequently gotten the years wrong for specific events. There was a famous desegregation protest that was 6 months long in Delaware against a segregated movie theater. And Biden and Smith talked about taking part in that in 1965, and it started in 62 and was over in 63. And Smith himself was a young man. He met Biden when Joe Biden was famously the only white lifeguard at a pool in a predominantly black part of Wilmington, Delaware, when he was 19. Smith was 13 at the time, and he says it was around that time that they attended these desegregation protests, when Smith himself was only a 13-year-old boy. So there's no direct evidence of it, and the campaign leans heavily on his account. It really comes down to whether people are going to take that man at his word. But Biden certainly has been, throughout this campaign, he's frequently made the claim again that he was, as a young man, a civil rights activist. And it seems like that's something that obviously will be challenged.
And, of course, Bernie Sanders' record himself as he was arrested in Chicago protesting racist housing policies.